All right, so it is 12 o'clock, so let's just get right into it. Welcome to the Automation Guild show, where we get together to help each other succeed in creating automation awesomeness. So it's a guild, it's not about me, it's about everyone that joins live with your input. And also, if you want to be part of the guild and you want to participate and you're not able to make it live, you can always go to automationguild.com/voice, click on record, leave me a voice message on a tip, tool, or technique you think will help the guild, and I'll play it back in a future episode. So today's episode is going to be all about iOS 11 and how it's going to affect your testing and automation efforts. Also, after last week's show, we covered AI, and we also went over some news items like the Flood.io acquisition by Tricentis. And what's really cool is they headed on over to automationguild.com/voice, and I actually have a voice message from the founder of Flood.io with his take on what the acquisition of Flood.io means, and also an interesting take on his view of the future of performance testing. I'd like to get your opinions on it once we hear it. And also we have our very first guild member message from Vicky, who talked about her thoughts on UI or AI automation. So I'm going to play that all back before we get into the iOS 11 news. We also have Greg Pascal back again with 4 tips you need to make your test automation efforts awesome. So the 4 things he's seen with locators that he's find helps him with his automation. So we're going to take a look at that also. So feedback. I don't know why that would be feedback. Helps him with his automation. But hopefully, like I said, when I play it back, I'll see it. On my end, the audio level looks okay. But before we get into it, leave a chat if you're in the chat. Anything you want to know about iOS 11. Like I said, if Amir Rosenberg, he's the folks at Perfecto that I talked to on iOS 11, you can always forward him your question if you had something that he didn't cover in today's presentation. So I guess before we get into the news of this week, let's go over what we went over last week. Like I said, I have some new information. The first one is from Tim from Flood.io. He's the founder of Flood.io. And something we went over last week was on the acquisition of Flood.io by Tricentis, which is an automation vendor. They acquired a performance test tool called Flood.io. And I was curious to know how the two are going to fit together. So Tim actually left a voice message on how he sees things going in the future, what it means for Flood.io, and he also has a vision for performance testing I thought was interesting. So let's hear what he has to say. How he sees things going in the future, what it means for Flood.io, and he also has.
G'day, it's Tim from Flood.io. I'm one of the co-founders of Flood, and I wanted to take a few minutes to tell you more about the exciting news around us joining forces with Tricentis and their continuous testing platform. Now, you may already know about Tricentis Tosca, and when we were first approached to join forces, Tosca's approach to test automation really struck a chord with the way we were thinking about load testing. Test automation is commonplace these days, and it seems everyone is having a go at it. Where it gets tricky, though, is how you build, execute, and maintain test automation suites. And where I think Tosca really shines is its approach to the whole lifecycle of test automation. Starting with a risk-based approach towards requirements, then onto abstraction and decoupling of business logic from automation, solid test data management and ability to control and execute scenarios, not to mention all the features which make tests less fragile and artifacts reusable between tests. All of this really appealed to us in terms of the direction we want to take load testing. For those listening and who have done load testing before, you will know the historical way of approaching load test scripting is at the protocol level. We already support what we call protocol level users with tools like JMeter and Gatling. But while simulating load at the protocol level, say HTTP, has the advantage of being able to generate lots of concurrent load from a single resource, that power also comes at a cost. The learning curve is steep and the complexity is easily underestimated in planning a load test effort. Many tools try, but there really is no easy way to capture or record tons of requests that modern web applications are doing, particularly in the open source world of load test tools. without a ton of overhead in terms of cleaning up, making sense of the request and response data, along with extracting relevant information. This means it can be hard to simulate realistic user behavior. Business-level interactions become more difficult to measure, not to mention the high set of skills needed to be moderately successful in your load test design and execution. So simulating protocol-level users seems okay at the start, and it can quickly spiral out of control. If we think about load testing through simulating browser-level users, something we've been doing for the past couple of years with Selenium WebDriver, you can approach load testing without a lot of the shackles associated with simulating protocol-level users. If you had asked me 10 years ago to spin up 1,000 load generators, I would have shaken my head or rolled my eyes. But what I see now, and certainly what customers are asking for, is the ability to spin up more and more nodes to support browser-level users. And why? Well, firstly, the economy of scale that the cloud gives us. At Flood.io, we regularly have customers launching hundreds of grid nodes to execute load tests, with a startup time that's measured in minutes and an effective cost that's measured in cents to the hour. And secondly, customers enjoy the relative simplicity of simulating user behavior at the browser level compared to the protocol level. One business action translates to, say, 2 automation commands in a browser, as compared to tens, if not hundreds of requests at the protocol level. Browser level functions like cache, cookie, and authentication or session management just work without intervention. Conceptually, there's less to understand. Objectively, there's less code to keep track of. Subjectively, the tests become less fragile depending on the approach on how you build, execute, and maintain your test automation. So that brings me back full circle to why I'm really excited about joining forces with Tricentis and our forthcoming Tosca Flood integration. On the Tosca side, we're seeing how far down the automation stack we can reuse in a load testing context. On the Flood side, we're putting browser-level users on a diet and getting some great concurrency per node as a result. We'll also continue supporting protocol-level users where it makes sense, for example, simulating load against APIs. Put it all together, and I'm really excited for the direction that we're heading. We'll also continue supporting protocol.
Awesome. Like I said, that was Tim from Flood.io. He is one of the founders of Flood.io. And I noticed I actually lost some viewers during that replay. So I'm still working on this format. If you don't like replays of people calling in, let me know. I thought it would add some unique value to this live session where it's not just me being a talking head, especially if I'm not getting a lot of interaction with folks in the chat. It really helps keep the flow really better. But I just want to touch on a few things that I think really are important with what Tim said, and I think it's kind of unique. If you've done performance testing before, you usually have a tool like LoadRunner where you use a different protocol like HTTP, and you totally just record a session, and then you totally bypass the browser because the server doesn't know if it's a browser, if it's a tool just sending the HTTP information back and forth between itself and the server. So you're able to scale up a lot of users on one machine, and those tests, in my experience, tend to be less flaky, quicker, faster, more reliable. But it sounded like what Tim was saying is they have a solution where they actually use Selenium tests where you drive a UI, a real browser. You don't have to use any protocols under the cover. And that was what they use as performance testing. And the reason why you weren't able to do that years ago is because you'd only be able to I had like a farm of maybe 15 machines, and it was really hard to maintain. But now with the cloud, you could spin up, into infinity. And I still think it would be a nightmare, but I'm sure they have some sort of solution in place to handle that. Just curious to know, I know Lazy Coder had a session at PerfGuild this year on performance testing, and he had some views on this as well. So just an interesting concept that I'd like to explore a little bit more. Just curious to know what you think about it. If you have any experience in actually using Flood.io and what your experience was using Selenium for performance tests, why not leave a message for the guild, and I'll play it back in a future episode. Head on over to automationguild.com/voice. All right, and speaking about comments, we got our very first comment. Like I said, this is episode 2. And this one's from Vicky. And this is on AI automation and what her concerns are around AI automation. And I actually forgot to import it. So we're actually going to skip that for the show. Next show, I'll play it back. But it's a very first comment by Vicky. She just talked about how automation with AI, how she thinks that could potentially be risky. And in my point of view, I understand it's risky, and that's why we as a guild, I think, have a voice to say in this. I think the job that we perform is not just working for social media. It's like we actually drive what the future will be with automation and maybe the ethics behind it or what we think is the right way to do it. So that's something that we can help through conversation, through talking to one another, help drive the discussion and how we move forward with any sort of automation techniques, especially if we start incorporating AI. How do we do it that's ethical, that it's safe, and that it's actually returning results that make sense to us? And that's what I think why we won't be replaced anytime soon, because that's the critical thinking that goes into any sort of testing, whether it's manual or automated, on testing in general. So the next clip I want to get into is, like I said, this is the news of the week, actually, before we get into it. A few news items I think are pretty interesting, and I'm just curious to get your take on it. Like I said, this is the news of the week, actually, before we get into it. A few news items I think are pretty interesting, and I'm just curious to get your... The first one is ThoughtWorks. I don't know if you've seen this recently, but ThoughtWorks has recently been acquired by an equity firm. And the reason why I thought this was newsworthy is ThoughtWorks are the folks that brought us Selenium, right? Jason Huggins worked there. He created Selenium there. They went on to open source it. Also, Simon Stewart, who came up with Selenium WebDriver, was working at ThoughtWorks. Also, at some time, he created Selenium. The person that created the Selenium Grid worked at ThoughtWorks. They have a new framework called Gauge, which was developed at ThoughtWorks. Cruise Control. So a lot of tools, a lot of technologies were developed out of the ThoughtWorks ecosystem. And I'm just wondering how this is going to affect the future of testing and automation, because it seemed like ThoughtWorks was kind of like a breeding ground for testing and automation, for all these projects to come alive and actually be pushed to the open source community. And even though I hear that, of course you hear this, and the culture's not going to change, everything will stay the same. Once you sell your company, especially to a private equity firm, in the end, it's about profits and bottom line. And I just, I'm worried that the culture at ThoughtWorks that helped produce all these awesome tools and technologies, and the people are really may be affected by it. And one of those folks that actually worked there is Martin Fowler, who's very famous for software development patterns, automation patterns. And he actually blogged about this on his site at martinfowler.com, talking about some of the reasons why the owner of ThoughtWorks ended up selling it, and how he thinks the culture is going to stay the same, and he doesn't see it changing anytime soon. So just interesting how, this just happened recently by ThoughtWorks. I didn't even know they were for sale. And like I said, a lot of cool technologies have came out of ThoughtWorks, especially automation things that affect us. So hopefully things will keep going as is there, and more cool stuff to come from them. Another piece of news I thought was interesting, especially since Perf Guild came on, was there was a new study done by, or a survey done by Apika, and they found that 60% of consumers will, after a poor website or app performance, won't return. And so this kind of scares me, because during this year's Perf Guild, if you were on Perf Guild, we had some performance issues, but hopefully it won't discourage people from joining next year. But they did a survey, and 60% of consumers, so that tells you that it doesn't matter what your brand is, no matter how strong it is with your customers, if you have bad performance, if they download your app and they click on it and right away they have bad performance, they're going to delete it and never come back. So, I know automation, a lot of times people just think about functional automation, but I really think we need to focus on end-to-end automation, anything that can help us create better, faster software, better quality, faster. Performance testing is one of those things I think more of us need to get involved in, because this is the bread and butter of most companies. Your website, your app, if they start losing views, start losing customers because of performance, potentially it'll affect your job, other people's jobs. So it's an important concept. Like to know what you think about it. If you're in the chat right now, leave me a message on what you think about any of these news items that I found, especially ThoughtWorks, or about the Apika survey. Really cool stuff. I'll have this in the show notes eventually. I'm still working on the site, but automationguild.com/show. That's where all these videos will be hosted, and the show notes at some point. Still working on that site. But like I said, if you had a very strong opinion that you want to share with the guild, or if you had any tip, tool, or technique you wanted to share, head on over to automationguild.com/voice, click on record, leave me a message. So that takes us to the main part of our show today, which is iOS 11. So Amir couldn't be with us live, so what I did is I met with him on a Zoom call, and I recorded the Zoom call talking about iOS 11. He works from Perfecto Mobile. They're always doing different types of research to see how things are going to affect things, especially as you start running tests in cloud against all these devices. When people start changing iOSs, especially such a major change like iOS 11, there's certain things that could happen that you may not even thought about. So I just want to make sure if you're involved in mobile testing and all, special iOS 11 testing, here's some things you should be thinking about, some changes, and let's see what Amir has to say. Hey, Amir. Welcome to the Automation Guild show.
Hey, Joe. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Awesome. So what I wanted to go over today really quick is I want you to share with the Guild your experience with iOS 11 and what they need to know about all the changes and how it may affect their test or their test strategy going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe, for allowing us to review the changes in iOS 11. So the first thing to know is that iOS 11 carries with it a lot of changes, and we recommend for developers and testers to get ready for iOS 11. This is the objective of this discussion. And maybe what the right thing to do is to start from the adoption curve for iOS 11 that we project based on what we've seen in iOS 10 and in iOS 9. And as you can see in the slides that are going to be distributed, within less than a month, the adoption jumped from around 2% for the new operating system to over 58%, and now it's in the 90%. So what we're going to see, what we predict to see, is that within a month, it's going to steadily cross 60%. And that's why you want to get started on testing iOS 11 applications beyond all the new features and the capabilities that are offered there. You want to get on the beta versions of iOS 11 and make sure of all the changes. So in this quick podcast, we're going to talk about the different iOS versions that you want to take a look at. We're going to talk about the changes to iOS 11. And lastly, we're going to talk about Appium and XUI test. So maybe with the curve of the adoption of iOS 11, the thing to remember is that we still have iOS 9 devices out there in production, and many of your applications would still need to operate on iOS 9. And so if you will, your lab needs to support both iOS 9, iOS 10, and iOS 11. Some of those devices are not going to get updated in their operating system. And so when you plan your testing, you need to plan accordingly the sort of composition of your lab. Let's talk about some of the changes that iOS 11 is introducing. So certainly iOS 11 is going to introduce new UI changes. It's going to have a control center that you can pop up in the middle of utilizing an application. It's going to have a new notification center that I've tried myself. It's very nice. It's going to have new UI capabilities, such as drag and drop functions, multitasking, and there's a new application that allows you to store files called the file system, access those files from within applications such as Drive, Dropbox, etc., and all kinds of functionalities that we didn't have that in the past that is related to access to files. And the next thing that's also going to change is the new application review process for the App Store. So in the past, application owners were able to essentially pop up a request from review from the user at any point in time. Now there's a new sort of guideline from Apple that says you need to follow these guidelines that I believe essentially say you can only pop up a review window only once in the lifetime of the application and so forth. So that's something to keep an eye on. The last change that I want to mention, I think this is going to be really big, is their machine learning, augmented reality, and Siri APIs. And I think what's happening there is that Apple is realizing what, you and I, Joe, we discussed, the rise of audio as the new interface to streamline activities in application, to drive more adoption. Even when people are driving and we don't want people typing into their phone, they will be able to access their bank account. And in there, I think there's a lot of applications. I've been tracking this. There's really a lot of applications out there that are bringing in application intelligence, AI, virtual assistants, and with that, chatbots, voice-driven chatbots. And we highly recommend, Joey, you and I covered this in the past, driving test automation, both for the mainstream, in the past we talked about the well-communicated Bank of America Erica virtual assistant, so driving both mainstream functionality and responsiveness test automation, and beyond that, also voice variants. And so we have a complete other podcast on that topic. I think this area is really, really going to be big, and it's going to disrupt the marketplace. The last point that I want to sort of double click on is the topic of iOS 11 and the changes involved in test automation, specifically if you move to Appium 1.6 and XCUI test. So as you know, already at the late stages of iOS 9, Apple announced that they're going to deprecate UI automation, which is essentially the approach you took if you wrote Appium tests to have object identifiers, object locators. Now in iOS 11, we actually see that it is completely blocked. And we highly recommend for testers, for developers, to make sure that while they're running their quality activities, you still need to run, testing on iOS 9, on iOS 10, you really need to modify your object locators and etc. to utilize what's called Smart XPath with iOS 11 devices. And while you do that, like I said earlier, iOS 11, you will only be able to access native objects via XUI test object identifiers. iOS 9, you still have to access those via UI automation. So you have this hybrid point in time where you need to utilize essentially almost two versions of scripts in order to create effective test automation. And iOS 10, depending on what solution you're using, the open source only supports XUI tests, where in Perfecto you can utilize a hybrid approach, either UI automation or XUI tests. The bottom line is that you really want to get your scripts, your object identifiers, to be utilizing XUI tests as soon as possible, because iOS 11 GA date is around the corner. One last thing that I want to mention is the topic of deprecated Appium functions. So there is a difference between Appium 1.6 and previous versions where some functions were deprecated. So there are new replacement functions in Appium, which you will need to adopt if you move to Appium 1.6. And of course, again, very similar to visual validation and automation, some other functions that Perfecto provides as proprietary, we backfill those gaps. And so a lot happening inside iOS 11. The last point that I want to mention regarding Appium 1.6 and the transition to XUI test. So we went ahead and we created a set of tools essentially to scan both your scripts as well as your test executions for XPath object locators that need attention and need to be slightly modified to be ready for XUI tests. And lastly, there's another tool. As you create a script and you create a new object locator, we have an open source tool that allows you to examine that XPath specifically and get, if you will, a score and a set of recommendations how to make that XPath essentially utilized, reusable across the different automation systems. All of that will be available in a set of links, Joe, that I will share with you. And I hope everybody will go through this transition successfully and quickly.
Awesome. Thank you, Amir, for joining the Guild and sharing your ideas on how to make iOS 11 as painless as possible for testers. Thank you for all the research you do and what you and for the open source utilities that you're going to be sending our way. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe.
Awesome. So that was Amir Rosenberg from Perfecto. Check him out. Like I said, I'll have those links in the show notes at automationguild.com/show. I'm still working on the site, so it's not pretty, but that's where the show notes will be. Just curious to know if anyone here actually has started using anything with iOS 11 in the beta, and if you have any tips that you think people should know about that wasn't covered. I think there's a lot of new functionality in this release of iOS 11 that is going to make us really have to start thinking about how do we automate these type of things, especially when we start dealing with chatbots or Siri, all these new audio features? How do we automate that? Do we use a golden copy of audio to test it? Those types of issues, I think a lot of things are going to be coming up in the future. So you can get ahead of it now, though, by downloading the iOS 11 beta and just getting your heads around the new APIs, the new functionality, and start thinking about how this is going to affect your development later on down the road and how you can start planning for it now. So that's why I wanted to get Amir on the show to talk about his experience. So time is flying by. I wanted to keep this at a half hour, so I'm going to jump right in and go into the next segment. Like I said, if you had a thought on iOS 11, just head on over to automationguild.com/voice. Click on record, leave me a message, and I'll play it back during an upcoming Automation Guild show. So Greg Pascal has 4 ways you can improve your automation, something he started to think about after seeing the eclipse, which was a pretty newsworthy item that happened recently here in the US.
Hello, fellow automators. This is Greg Pascal coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. I got some cool stuff to share with you today. You know, this was a really special week in the week of the United States because we had an event called a solar eclipse. Actually, where I live in Nashville, we had a total solar eclipse. It's the first one I've ever seen in my lifetime. Probably be the last one I'll ever see. This is an amazing event to see. For months, these scientists and these sort of folks were calculating this event down to the second it would arrive, and that's exactly what happened. I went outside with many of my coworkers, and we had these special glasses, and we looked up, and just on as if it was scheduled, right on time, man, that eclipse came into view, and we looked at it. It was an amazing event. Scientists prepared for months. They put up weather balloons. They positioned the shuttle to capture the shadow of the eclipse. It was amazing. If you think about the math that they went over and over and over again to ensure they had the best possible data to capture this eclipse. So, I want you to think about this. When was the last time you intentionally scheduled time to review the science behind your test automation efforts? Really, I hope it's more than once in a lifetime like an eclipse. This should be something you're thinking about, a couple times a year at the very least. I know what it's like. We're writing code all day. We're running tests. We're working with folks, making sure that we're writing the proper test. You just get busy and you get consumed with it over and over again. But it's good to take time to consider the things that our automation is built upon, the science, right, the engineering efforts, and that they're in really great shape. I want to share with you a couple of them that would be really easy things to start with as a review. Maybe you'll even decide to schedule it this week or next week sometime. The first one is around the area of locators. Yes, locators are those things that help us interact with buttons and fields and objects within the applications that we're testing. Here's a couple things to consider when it comes to locators. How often am I maintaining my locators? In the standard that I apply, I really shouldn't need to interact with locators once I've designed and engineered them into my test very often. Unless there's an application change, there should be no real need to go and tweak locators. The second is, how easily can I debug locators? Yeah, you heard me right. Debugging locators. That might even seem like a foreign concept to you. Do you know that that's possible? So you should consider, can I debug my locators, or do I have to make a change and then run my test again to see if it worked? There are ways to do that, and maybe we'll cover those in a future podcast here. Is there a better or more reliable way to do my locators? How many properties or attributes are you?
Sorry. My bad, people.
Is there a better or more reliable way to do my locators? How many properties or attributes are you using in your locators? Did you know that there's actually kind of a sweet spot where it's good? Can you believe that I might even introduce that you want some brittleness in your test? I know that seems to be like a crazy way to think about it, but we want locators that are precise and targeted so that they do exactly what they're supposed to and interact with exactly what they're supposed to. But when that object isn't what it's supposed to, we want the test to fail. So that's kind of the art of the locator. The second area I want to encourage you to think about when it comes to the science or engineering is, what's your synchronization approach? Like, is it really solid? Many years ago, I was preparing to speak at a conference, and I started thinking about the challenge that we run into as automation engineers when it comes to synchronization. Most of us start off synchronization, our synchronization strategy is around by inserting wait statements or sleep statements or some sort of delay before we continue on. You know, I'm not going to fault you for that. That's a way to get started. That isn't the way to move forward in the long term with your test automation synchronization efforts. It'll get you over the hump to begin with, but you need to come up with a better approach. So this is a great area where solid engineering can come into play. And many test engineers really, this isn't a thorn in their side and they struggle with it. And they just go back to putting waits and delays in their scripts and they hope for the best. I often say that wait equals hope when it comes to test automation. You've got to come up with a better approach than that. So let's think about what's the goal of synchronization. Well, it's really to determine the state of an application and the objects that we're interacting with. There are 4 primary synchronization methods or functions that every automation tester should have in their toolbox. You should have these things nailed. The first one is what I call wait to exist. So there's some sort of delay in there, but you're continually polling for an object or the state of an object, and when it gets to that state, you can move on. We usually set some maximum amount of time. Sometimes we'll set how often should it query to see if the state of this object is set to that before we move on. That's the first one, wait to exist. The second one is wait to not exist. Yeah, sometimes we need to synchronize based upon things going away or disappearing. Similar to the first wait to exist, wait to not exist obviously has a certain amount of time. It's going to wait while it's polling for the state of an object to not exist. The third and fourth are similar, really simpler versions of these functions or methods. And that is, does it exist right at this moment? And the fourth one is, does it not exist at this moment? Having those 4 synchronization strategies within your libraries to pull on regularly is going to be an awesome tool for you to have as automation engineers. So go after those things. And if you don't have them, put some time on the calendar to go and reconsider your engineering around that, your science around it, and do it really well. So go to your calendar today. Put some time 3 to 6 months out to say, I'm going to revisit the engineering, the science of my test automation at this point in time to make sure it's in good shape, and then you'll schedule your next one out from there and there. You control the success of your test automation efforts, so put in the time to do it well. This is Greg Pascal in Nashville, Tennessee. I'll be talking to you all next week. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg, for sharing those awesome tips, especially locators is something that I think a lot of people struggle with. And I think that's a great idea. Not only should we be creating automation, but we actually should be pruning our automation, going through and planning after each sprint to say, is this test still needed? Because the more tests you have, the more tech debt you have. If those tests aren't adding any more value, they're only going to slow down your test runs and add more maintenance time. So you always want to go through pruning also. So I think that's a great idea to do a planning session every so often to actually go over your tests and see where you stand with automation, how you can improve, what things can change. So thank you for that, Greg. All right, so I really want to get in before we end Vicky. Vicky called in. She went to automationguild.com, automationguild.com/voice. She clicked on recording. She left a message. So this is our very first guild member message. I just wanted to share it because I thought it's kind of cool how she took time to actually take the initiative and do that. So let's see if I can get this working. If not, we'll save it for next week. And it looks like we're having some technical difficulties here. So I'll play that back next week. And if you want to participate in the guild, make sure to head on over to automationguild.com/voice. Leave your message, and I'll play it back in a future episode. So that's it for this episode of the Automation Guild Show. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. Cheers.